Okay, let's dive into the latest on Bitcoin market sentiment. We're looking at the sources you shared.
Yeah, Bitcoin's price has been pushing past $110,000 several times lately.
Right, and some indicators look super bullish, but the real question the material asks is, does this high sentiment mean, broad retail interest is actually back?
Hmm, it's a really interesting puzzle presented by the data, isn't it? We'll try to pull out the key insights for you, help you understand what these sources are suggesting.
So we're looking at social media sentiment, the fear and greed index.
And importantly, Google Trends for search interest.
Okay, so let's start with the bullish side. The sources point to sentiment data showing bullish sentiment on social media is like at a 7-month high.
That's right. One source actually gives a specific number for June 11th, 2.12 positive Bitcoin comments for every negative one.
Wow, 2.12 positive for every negative.
Yeah.
Across places like X, Reddit, Telegram.
Yeah, and others like 4chan, Bitcoin Talk, Farcaster too.
That's a pretty strong positive lean. And the sources note this is the highest since, what, November 6th?
Exactly. Which is significant because, that day was just after the U.S. election outcome.
And when Bitcoin first broke $70,000.
Precisely. So there's a link between this recent social sentiment peak and a previous price jump.
Got it. Then there's the crypto fear and greed index. The sources mention this too.
Mm-hmm. It factors in volatility, volume, social media, trends, all that stuff.
And it's currently in the greed zone. Score of 71 out of 100.
Yeah, 71, definitely greed. But one source makes a key comparison.
Okay.
It contrasts the 71 with a much higher score, 94 out of 100, back on November 22nd.
94. Wow.
Yeah, that peak also followed the election outcome mentioned during that big climb towards $100,000, from around like $67,700 up to $99,250.
So, okay, 94 versus 71 now. Greed is definitely there, but maybe not that peak euphoria we saw just a few months ago, according to this index.
That seems to be the takeaway. And the sources mention, while recent price gains are often chalked up to institutional buying or even nation state.
Right, we hear that a lot.
This shift in retail sentiment, even if it's not at that November high, it could still add some fuel to the fire.
Okay, so you've got high social media buzz. The fear and greed index says participants are greedy. It sounds like retail is pretty engaged.
It does sound like it, doesn't it? But,
Right.
and this is the interesting part, another data set from the sources kind of paints a different picture.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's about broader public interest. Google Trends data for Bitcoin searches tells a contrasting story.
How so?
Well, when you look at search interest now compared to its highest point over the last 12 months,
Which was when?
that week of November 10th, 16th, when Bitcoin broke $90,000. Compared to that peak, current search interest only scores a 32 out of 100.
32 out of 100.
Yeah.
Compared to just last November, that's quite a drop.
It is, and it gets even starker if you compare it to the all-time high search interest back in late 2017.
Okay.
Compared to that peak, today's score is only 19 out of 100.
19. Wow. Okay, so Google Trends is basically saying widespread public search interest hasn't really come roaring back yet, despite the price.
That's what the data suggests, yeah.
So how do we square this then? You've got these indicators, sentiment, fear, and greed, showing pretty intense sentiment among maybe active participants.
Right.
But then Google Trends suggests the general public isn't really searching for Bitcoin like they did during past big run-ups. What do the sources say about why there's this gap?
Yeah, that divergence is really the core finding here. The sources seem to imply that metrics like sentiment social data and the fear and greed index, they might be tracking the mood of people already in the space.
Like traders, the crypto enthusiasts, people already holding Bitcoin.
Exactly. The already engaged crowd, their sentiment is high.
Okay.
Whereas Google Trends, especially when you look at those historical comparisons, that might reflect broader public curiosity more. People searching Bitcoin for the first time, or maybe checking back in after being out for years.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's say the crypto native crowd is bullish, but the wider public isn't necessarily rushing to Google asking, what is Bitcoin? Like they might have before.
Precisely. It suggests the current market move, while strong and maybe getting a boost from that existing retail sentiment, it might not yet be fueled by that really widespread mass public curiosity that we saw drive parts of previous big rallies. The sources keep pointing back to institutional flows, maybe nation-state adoption, as bigger drivers right now.
So wrapping this up for you listening, based on these sources, we're seeing a split picture. High sentiment among active groups, on social media, market participants feeling greedy. But that's contrasted with data like Google Trends suggesting broader public interest is still pretty low compared to previous peaks.
Yeah. Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you to consider. Given this contrast, this gap between active market sentiment and maybe lagging broader public interest, how might this market cycle play out differently?
Right, compared to cycles maybe more driven by that huge retail wave.
Exactly. What would it actually take for that broad Google search interest to really pick up again? And, how significant would that be if it suddenly did?
Definitely something to think about as you watch the markets.